So Tottenham Hotspur have fallen to a first league defeat of the season. So let's get straight to Tottenham Hotspur 1, Aston Villa 2. So going into this game, the real big news ahead of the game was that Destiny Udogie wasn't going to be involved due to a knee issue that he picked up whilst training with the Italy first team. Um, Also, Randall Kolo Muani coming into a Premier League squad for the first time. And also, the big news really was that Christian Romero was going to miss this game. Mickey van der Ven spoke in the interview after the game, and he said that, it's a knock that Romero was sort of nursing during the week, and it was going to be a late one, and in the end, he just didn't make it. So Kevin Danso come in for him, and on left back, Jed Spence comes in for Destiny Udogie. But we started well. I think we were on foot, scored straight away. Paulinho and Bergval, who are going to be a bit of a talking point of this particular podcast, combining with a goal, and then we looked threatening without actually doing a lot. So in the first half, up until their equaliser, really, we were counter-attacking well. We looked pretty solid at the back and didn't really look like we were in for much trouble. And then a brilliant Morgan Rogers goal. Just sort of, I think like that was the goal that changed the game rather than Villa's second. But there was a couple of times where we got in the first half down that left-hand side through Odegaard. He was getting forward a lot more and he was more involved, which is promising. I think he's probably the best selection on that left wing currently. But there's a lot of times where he'd get into the box and then he'd slow down. And usually when you slow down, you lose all momentum unless you've got that next picture in your head of what you want to do next with the ball. And it almost felt like Odegaard got into the box, and Matty Cash sort of stood off him and just allowed Odegaard to make the mistake. And then more often than not, Odegaard just wasn't able to make that final third. I don't know what you call it, that sort of significant impact in the final third. There was one where Xavi Simons was crying out on the edge of the box, literally pointing at his feet, and I think after he lost his head with Odegaard because he was unmarked, arriving into sort of that edge of the D into the box, that sort of zone, and it's completely unmarked, and it almost feels like that's where we're lacking at the minute in terms of that sort of natural sort of fluidity in attack. It looks very regimented and a bit one-dimensional at the minute. But the truth is, we did as poor a performance as that was, we definitely had chances to win it, and we just weren't clinical enough. And it was just in that final third, we just couldn't make a difference. Kudus did score to make it 2-0, but it was offside, and Kudus had a great game. I think he's been our player of the season so far. But it's one of them when you're looking back at the replays, you think you could just drop 3 or 4 yards, and it's one of them offsides where you don't need to be offside. You can afford to wait a couple more seconds. But Kudus, again, he was by far our best player on the day. I thought he was really, really good. Slightly concerning that a lot of our play seems to be just get it to Kudus and see what he can do. On the left, we're seeing it a bit more with Odegaard sort of carrying the ball up the pitch, but in that final third, he just doesn't really, or at least yet, he's not shown that really clinical side to his game, which we probably see in France under 21s and Matisse Tell as well, who started up front. And it feels like a lot of our build up is coming through the wings, and in particularly the right wing, and then through the middle, we're just not having anything. I think there's a graphic doing the rounds of Rodrigo Bentancur's passing of his pass maps, and I'm sure I'll insert it somewhere in the video. All of them are left, right, and there are no lines where you're looking to sort of get into that zone between the midfield and defence and look to get the ball forward quickly. It's very much safe passing. And when you've got someone next to him like Paulinho, who's in the team for just how brilliant he is at winning the ball back and then getting it to someone else. And we've even seen a few times him popping up um, in the opposition box this season. But it just feels like that's a pairing that really needs to change in these sorts of games. If you're away from home and it's a game where you're not really expected to have much possession, I'd say fair enough. That is completely understandable. We've seen it against Manchester City and it worked completely fine because I think that was one of those games where Thomas Frank wouldn't have minded not having a lot of the ball. But when you're at home and you're a club like Tottenham, the fans are expecting with the ticket prices as ridiculous as they are. And then also the fact that, we're building momentum after an international break and that sort of thing. And I seen something that said about our last three home wins in the Premier League, and it was something like 11 months that it took us to register. That's the amount of wins we've got in the last 11 months. And Sunderland have already matched that, and they've been in the league since August. I don't think it can be downplayed how bad our home form has been. And there are many reasons why you could say, for people saying about atmosphere, I think it's one of them things, it's a double-sided coin. So for me personally, I think the fans they don't need a lot to get going. And you see it with Bergvall, where he comes over and he does that to get the fans up. And that is a pet hate of mine. Um, but I digress. You see in them moments where they ask a bit more of the fans that would deliver. But also there's part of you which thinks, well, there needs to be some give and take because if Spurs put in a performance like they did in the second half, then our atmosphere is going to be flat because fans, no one ever really felt like we were going to get a second goal in that game. And I think we really need to make, White Hart Lane a fortress again. It's it's been too easy for away teams to come and pick up points, and it's it's worrying that we're, moving back through the last sort of 2 years and even sort of the last 6 months of the season prior to Ange. Our home form's been terrible, and you think back to White Hart Lane. Yes, we weren't always as good as we were in 16, 17, but generally, even when we were a little bit crap, um, sort of, you know, I say crap, what I'd define as like the lower, sort of periods of supporting Tottenham, we're always quite decent at home. We could always give teams, a good game, but it just feels like since we've gone into that new stadium, we've never really made that a fortress. There was a brief period under Conte where second half of the season we sort of looked imperious at home. I can remember in particular run of where I think we beat Newcastle 5-1, we beat Leicester and a few other teams in that period, but beat Arsenal 3-0 as well. But yeah, we really need to we need to make sure that when teams come to us, they don't, they're in for, a real hard game up in your face, not letting you have a lot of the ball. And I think a lot of that is up to Thomas Frank to find that formula at home. I think Bentancur and Paulinho serves a purpose, but only in sort of particular games. And I think if you're starting any home game really, unless it's a team where you're really not expected to have the ball, I don't think it should be Paulinho and Bergvall. I think it should either be, one of Paulinho or Sarr, and then maybe a Bergvall or Gray. And someone like Archie Gray yesterday, I was thinking, why is he not coming on? I think he was on the bench. If he wasn't on the bench, I'm gonna look like a complete fucking idiot now. But we signed him for a lot of money last season, and look, he's 19, and I'm not saying that Archie Gray's the answer, and he's going to come in, he's going to sort of, paper over the cracks of all of our problems and take us to eternal glory. But what I will say is, Frank's got those options available. I think with our midfield in particular, we've got a lot of options, but not a lot of quality in specific areas. And that DM area, yes, Paulinho, is excellent at winning the ball back and that sort of thing. But I think you need someone next to him like a Bergvall or a Gray who's going to advance, the ball a bit more, be a bit more ambitious with, sort of their pass and not be afraid to maybe pinch a few yards and step higher up into the box. And I really, I really just really didn't enjoy yesterday at all. And I really just in particular didn't enjoy the not Bergvall, the Bentancur and Paulinho midfield. And a talking point from the game will be Xavi Simons again, sort of drawing a blank and not really, performing to the levels that we would expect of, a player for a reputation like his. But I do have an element of sympathy. He's definitely getting involved in the first sort of 15, 20 minutes. He was really putting in a shift in defensively. But I think there'll be another graphic that I insert here, which will show the average sort of positions from Sunday's game. And the area to Simmons is just completely isolated. It's almost like a sort of horseshoe in terms of formation. And Simmons is sort of really not connecting with the players around him. And I think really he's sort of been feeding off sort of scraps from Odegaard and Kudus when the ball, they're coming inside, drawing players in. And there's one of the first half I mentioned earlier with Odegaard, and it was just perfectly set to lay it to Simmons. He would have had a free shot on goal from roughly inside the box by a few yards. Didn't get it. But then there's also one in the second half where Xavi Simmons got the ball. He cut inside, and in the sort of all the highlights that we watched before he signed for Tottenham, you were seeing these goals similar to some where they'd cut inside and they just really whip it across goal into the far corner. Something that Felipe Coutinho was brilliant at when he was at Liverpool. And it was a perfect opportunity. And he took an extra touch, and you're thinking, now hit it. And then he took an extra touch, and then eventually he just runs into danger. And a game like yesterday, where there was just nothing to be excited about, that was sort of one of the few moments that, sort of looked like we could score, but we didn't, take the opportunity when it come to even take a shot. I want to go on to the Villa's equaliser, Morgan Rogers' goal. It was a good hit, but again, I think you can maybe put some question marks at Vicario's door if you're being harsh, and it feels like that's been a theme really in the last sort of 6 to 7 games with Vicario. Um, it's one that reminded me a lot of when Paul Robinson was playing for Spurs and sort of towards, I think it was his last season at Spurs, the year we won the League Cup, and he seemed to look so like slow and sort of far away from the ball when he dive. And I think with Vicario, I think he was quite far off of his line, so he sort of had to judge the ball early, but he's also down very low when the shot was taken, and it was almost like he sort of dropped a few yards too soon. Maybe I'm being harsh, but again, I think you could put question marks at his door. I think Spurs have got, bigger issues in terms of the squad building. I think left wing's a position we really need to address, especially in centre midfield as well, potentially, and maybe a left back or a left centre back before we'd probably touch on the goalkeeper. But it's a weird one with Vicario. You wonder sort of how much the sort of injuries from last year are affecting him. He doesn't seem to be that great at, dealing with shots from range, and I wonder if that might be maybe if there's not that strength in his ankles to sort of put his weight down and that sort of thing, which maybe I'm clutching at straws. Maybe I'm being, too kind to Vicario, or maybe, someone who has actually played in goal and could tell me their perspective is probably thinking that I'm talking rubbish, and that maybe it won't be the first time, and Definitely won't be the last. But it's something that I am keeping an eye on. I think going into the season, there was a few players who I was sort of keeping a steady eye on. Romero was one in particular before he was made captain, because even before he was made captain, there's some question marks about his availability and sort of prioritising Argentina over Tottenham. And I think Romero so far, I've not really had to worry too much about the sort of preconceived doubts I had going into the season. But with Vicaria, it's getting harder and harder to ignore as time's going on. I don't think it's, I suppose, the most pressing issue at the minute, but I think maybe it's one that in a season or two we might maybe be looking to move him on. And then Villa's goal, Jesus, genuinely one of the best goals I've ever seen in the Premier League. That goal, you can try like 100 times. The way that all worked out, the crossfield ball by Cash, the touchdown by Digne, and the finish all in that sequence. And sometimes you just know it's not going to be a day. And as soon as that goal went in, you just knew that that was it, and there was going to be no sort of change to the scoreline at all. Um, and I mentioned about the Xavi Simons shot, or the non-shot, which he didn't take, and it was exactly the sort of position that Buendia was in on his weak foot, and he hit it. And I think that's maybe Buendia, who's been playing in England for about, I don't know, maybe 6 or 7 years now, maybe a bit longer, and Simmons, who's, still in his first sort of half season, but just just disappointing. And yeah, I think that was all to report really. Kolo Muani come on for his Premier League debut, but really, really didn't do much. So up next for Spurs is a trip to the south of France, to Monaco. It's a ground which is sort of European Tottenham heritage. I always sort of associate us playing Monaco in Europe. Maybe that's because the double header we had between 2015 and 2017 with them. But yeah, I think it's quite a sort of Spurs heritage draw in terms of us getting Frankfurt, getting Bodo, Dortmund at home, all sort of teams that we've played before. Obviously, there's the other trip to France we've got coming up, PSG, which is not going to be fun at all. Um, but I definitely think that this is a game we can definitely win. Monaco have recently got rid of their manager. They did draw against Man City, so I'm not anticipating it being an easy game. But I was just looking before at the league positions last year and what sort of points would take you through. And I think 16 points last year was the minimum, which got eighth place through. And with us on four already, a draw against Bodo and a win against Villarreal. It's a game which, if we can win, we put ourselves in a really, really good position, especially with games like Copenhagen, Slavia Prague at home coming up. We'd put ourselves in really, really good position to not only get into the playoffs, but also into that top eight if we can do it. But I'm also aware that this is Tottenham away in Europe, and barring last season, there have been a lot of bad European performances away from home when on paper they seem pretty winnable games. Obviously, Monaco have got Magnus Akalush, who we were linked with quite heavily throughout the summer. They've also got the likes of Paul Pogba and most importantly Eric Dyer, who isn't going to be in the team. I think he's missing this one through injury. But it's a real opportunity for Spurs, and I'm anticipating there being changes. It's one that, ironically, if we're saying about Paulinho and Bentancur in midfield, it being too defensive and too sort of playing with the handbrake off, and calls for, Gray or Sarr or Bergvall to come in. Quite ironic that I would probably pick Paulinho and Bentancur for this game, just to give us that bit of steel. Um, but I think moving forward in the home games, I think there's got to be some sort of change. But tomorrow night, or today as this will go out, Monaco away from home, really good opportunity to really set ourselves up nicely, because I'm not anticipating us getting loads from the Paris Saint-Germain game. And there's also a busy November coming up, and it's going to test us. So if we can put ourselves in a position where we're leaving Monaco with a win, that sets us up really nicely. And then you've obviously got trips to Frankfurt coming up, and then Slavia Prague at home, PSG away, Copenhagen at home, Dortmund at home. Um, yeah, definitely a good opportunity for us, and hopefully we'll come back here after Tottenham have sealed a win in France. That's what I'm going to be praying for tonight as I go to bed. And until then, up the Spurs.